actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
Flashback.
This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
And it's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
That's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It's not about NATO. NATO is just a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
Hang on, I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, Russia has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine, but if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war.
He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. We rejected that.
The reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is because of his evil.
It's
about that Putin wants to rebuild Soviet empire of evil, like President Reagan told.
It's about Putin being sick.
I don't know how you negotiate peace with a madman, but
Nobody negotiated with Hitler.
People are comparing him to Hitler.
And remember Hitler?
He's a Hitler.
We're back when the Nazis invaded Poland.
This is exactly the same what Hitler was doing to Jews.
This is the same. Putin will not stop.
Putin is reminiscent of Hitler.
Hitler.
This reminds me of Hitler.
He's the new Hitler.
Oh, Hitler.
This is about a butcher trying to kill people everywhere in the world. Just not Ukraine, Syria, all over the place.
I hear you. Senator Lindsey Graham, always great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right.
That's bullshit. He's fucking lying. He's lying to our fucking faces.
In today's episode, I welcome to the studio Scott Ritter. He is a former United Nations weapon inspector and U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer. In today's conversation, we break down the long and complicated history of Russia and Ukraine, explain why a neutral Ukraine remains the key to peace, and answer the question, will this be America's next forever war? Today's episode is a must-watch for anyone wanting to understand the truth behind the Ukraine conflict. Let's begin. So everyone, I want to welcome into the studio Scott Ritter. Scott, you have been a very prominent voice here in the war on Ukraine. Obviously, your background is very extensive. Obviously, a former United Nations weapons inspector. You've also been a United States Marine Corps intelligence officer. Scott, thank you for joining our show today.
Thanks for having me. Nation, to look out for them. So now we come into 2014. The Maidan coup takes place. In and of itself, not a trigger for war. I mean, Is Russia happy? Of course not. But are they going to invade? No. First of all, this coup empowered the Banderist element, that CIA-funded activity we were talking about. It wasn't just by accident. Remember Victoria Nuland, who is prominent today as the Deputy Secretary of State. At the time, she was an Assistant Secretary of State for managing that part of the world. And she had that infamous phone call where she said, F the EU, but she also said, my boy Yats. And she talks about Yats and his relationship with a certain organization, the right sector, Sloboda Party, Nazis. She was okay with it, meaning that we knew that these were Nazis, yet we're okay with them rising into power to become prime ministers, the head of the intelligence, the head of interior. So we knew what we were doing. So therefore, when these neo-Nazis now and if you listen to their own account, they talk about how they became violent. They admit that they're a minority politically, but they used violence to leverage themselves into being the dominant power They threaten, they intimidate people to do the policies they want. These are guys who immediately turned down and went to Odessa, where Odessa's a primarily Russian city in Ukraine. Demonstrations in the street against these guys. They held a counter demonstration, ended up in a street fight, and they pushed about 150 of these pro-Russian or ethnic Russians into a trade union building, I believe, was set the building on fire, and 48 of them were killed, burned to death. Some of them jumped out of the building, shot as they tried to flee the building. A current member of the Ukrainian parliament, and I mentioned the parliament because here in America we like to call Ukraine a democratic country. A current member of the Ukrainian parliament was filmed while he was a junior member of that parliament walking outside that building, kicking the bodies of the Russian dead to make sure they were dead. This is the kind of people we're dealing with. Now, they went from there to Crimea. And remember, this is in May, and they head towards Crimea. Actually, in March, they head towards Crimea. The Russians say, no, we're not letting you do this. And the Russian people stood up. Now, Putin had his hands tied, couldn't send the military in, because constitutionally, you're not allowed to send the military into non-Russian areas without the permission of the parliament. Right. So they brought in the little green men. Now you see the birth of Wagner. And they come in and they initiate actions that lead to declaration of independence, referendum, Crimea becomes part of Russia, etc. The Nazis, frustrated in Crimea, turn their attention to Mariupol, the city on the Sea of Azov, where Russians again have risen up and said, we don't want the Nazis here. They come in and brutally oppress these people, beginning the Civil War, where the ethnic Russians said, enough is enough, we're beginning to fight. This is in 2014. Putin, together with Wagner, together with the Russian army, crushed the Ukrainians. And by August, they had the Ukrainian army surrounded. And all he had to do is continue the fight. He would have killed about 14 to 20,000 Ukrainians, but it would have crushed Ukraine. It would have been over. All of it would have ended right there. All Putin had to do, he had them surrounded, could have killed them. Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, receiving frantic phone calls from Petro Poroshenko, the President of Ukraine, intervened, said, Putin, don't do this. Please don't do this. He said, why not? They're bad people. They've been killing Russians. My job is to defend the Russian nation. Listen, give peace a chance. Give peace a chance.
Right.
And you know what Putin did? He gave peace a chance. He ordered the Russians to stand down. He let the Ukrainians free, and thus started the Minsk Accords, which was basically to set the stage for a peaceful resolution of this problem. One nation and one nation alone was serious about the Minsk Accords. And that was Russia under Vladimir Putin. We now know today, to make a long story short, that Angela Merkel admits it was a sham. All the Minsk Accords was to buy time so NATO could train a Ukrainian army capable of standing up to the Russians. Francois Hollande says the same thing, but Poroshenko says the same thing. In 2015, the United States and NATO began their training mission in Ukraine, training every 55 days, 1 battalion of Ukrainian troops up to NATO standards. That lasted all the way up till the beginning of the conflict. Putin kept saying, we need to make Minsk happen. We need to make Minsk happen. This is how we solve this problem. In June of 2021, he met with Joe Biden in Geneva. And there, all he said to Joe is, you know, you're worried about me moving troops around inside Russia, but if you want it to stop, just get the Ukrainians to sign Minsk. That's it. Just get them to sign Minsk. But Biden knew that it was a sham, but he lied to Putin. He said, yes, I'll get Blinken right on the job. The meeting took place in June. July, Putin's waiting. August, he's waiting. September, he's waiting. October, he summons, Lavrov summons the French and the Germans in, together with the Ukrainians. He said, sign Minsk right now. They went, no, we're not going to sign it. So that was the end of Minsk. Russia should have invaded there if that's what they were about, war. But instead, Russia drafts 2 draft treaties. On December 17, 2021, they issue 1 draft treaty to NATO, 1 to the United States. They said, this is how do we resolve this problem. We talk about a new European security framework. We don't expect you to sign it right now, but you have to talk with us earnestly. You have to be serious about this, and we can peacefully resolve this thing. We don't want to go to war. The United States ignored it in January. In the final weeks of January, leading up to February, the Russians were desperately talking to the Ukrainians, saying, please, let's just solve this thing. We don't want to go to war. We don't want to go to war. Finally, they had no choice. February 24th, because the Ukrainians were building up a military force ready to strike into the Donbass. Remember that military force that Angela Merkel said we had to buy time to build so they could do this? Well, it was built, and they were ready to rock. So the Russians preempted it. Article 51, collective self-defense, preempted self-defense. It's lawful under thing. You have an imminent threat, you respond to it. The Russian goal wasn't just to stop the imminent attack. It was to get the Ukrainians back to the negotiating table. They never wanted to defeat the Ukrainian army or to occupy Kiev. All they wanted to do was pressure the Ukrainians to go to the negotiating table. 6 days after they crossed the border, the first negotiation began in Gomel. There were 3. In April, early April, they had a 4th negotiation in Turkey where they completed a treaty. It was signed off on both sides, sent back. They were supposed to gather, I'm sorry, it was in March. They were supposed to get back on 1 April in Istanbul to finish this thing. The war would have been over. The war would have been over. And what were the Russians going to give them? All of the territory they occupied since February 24 was going back. They weren't there for territorial acquisition. They weren't there to steal Ukrainian territory. They made a good faith measure, by the way. In accordance to the agreement, they said, we're going to withdraw from Kiev and from Sumy. And when you sign it, we'll withdraw from Kharkov. We'll withdraw from Kherson. We'll withdraw from Zaporizhia. Donetsk, or the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, will become independent. They declared it's not our business. We can't undo that. What we want is international people to come in and see a referendum about what they want to be. Independent, with Russia, with Ukraine, let them decide. A fantastic agreement. And Ukraine walked away from it. Ukraine walked away from it. So anybody who sits there and says, well, Russia got their butts kicked, you have no clue what Russia was trying to do in the first phase of the conflict. It wasn't to conquer Kiev. So failure to conquer Kiev does not indicate anything other than that wasn't Russia's objective. Russia's objective was to get Ukraine to the negotiating table, bring early into this conflict, and Russia won. It was only when NATO told Ukraine not to continue that Russia had to move on to phase 2. They didn't want to do phase 2. They never.
You see this issue in the Middle East and Israel being more dangerous to global peace and stability than the Russia-Ukraine situation?
Oh, yes, because you have a rational actor in Moscow. There is no rational actor in Washington. That's the problem. You know, the rational actor is sitting in Moscow. He says, look, I don't want to kill Ukrainians. He never did. This is what people don't understand. The Russians look upon the Ukrainians as Orthodox Christian Slavs. Why should they kill Orthodox Christian Slavs? They felt they were left with no alternative. Ukrainians, as a people, don't understand the extent to which they've been manipulated into this war. And Ukrainians are very fine people. They're nationalistic, they're committed, but they're also living in the past. They're mistaking Russia for the Soviet Union. It's not. They're mistaking Russia for communism. It's not. And that has helped fuel this horrible, pointless, destructive war. We've got to stop it.